Yes, Mrs. Worthington, I understand. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Of course, Mrs. Worthington, I will definitely do that. Will this old chatterbox with blue hair ever shut up? Susan Morgan asked herself desperately, listening to the chatter of the wife of the chairman of the board of directors of the Birch Grove Mansion and Museum. But as director of development at Birch Grove, Susan knew she had no choice but to listen and agree with the older woman's sermon. The young woman was not inclined to tolerate fools with joy, and it especially annoyed her when someone considered himself smarter than her only because of the wealth of his family. I've already seen enough rich bitches who think their money allows them to be authorities in other people's affairs, Susan growled to herself. A glance at her watch only deepened her despair. She's late for an important meeting. But just as Susan was about to interrupt the conversation, the elderly woman abruptly interrupted the monologue. God, look at the time. If I don't hang up right now, I'm going to be late for my appointment with the hairdresser. I understand, Mrs. Worthington. I'm sorry to keep you, Susan replied without a trace of sarcasm. After her interlocutor finally hung up, Susan quickly sent her husband a text message. Dinner with a promising partner. Don't wait. When the message was sent, she hurriedly tidied up her desk, checked her makeup in a hand mirror, and walked out the door of her small office. Originally, this room was the butler's pantry in the Birch Grove Mansion, but at least my name is written on the door, she thought. As she headed down the hall, Evita, her Latin American secretary, called out to her. Are you leaving, Senor Morgan? Without slowing down, Susan glanced irritably over her shoulder. I'm going to visit a potential sponsor. I won't be back today. Evita watched the rhythmic movement of the skirt of her boss's expensive suit and heard the click of her high heels on the marble floor of the mansion. As soon as the woman disappeared through the door, Evita rushed down the corridor to the executive director's office and stopped at his secretary's desk. Gone? She asked Christina. Si, Christina replied. About 10 minutes ago. He said he had an important meeting. Evita grinned at him. As scheduled. This week, last week, the day before last. Do both have meetings at the same time? Do they think we don't know what's really going on? She looked towards the exit and hissed. Both young women giggled and went back to work. Professor Daniel Morgan looked at the many faces in his introduction to economics class. Although he knew that only a few of them would take a long-term interest in economics, he hoped that he could at least kindle some intellectual curiosity about the subject. In order to arouse this interest, an unconventional approach will be required. He clicked on the icon on his tablet computer and a graphic appeared on the wall. Today, he announced, we will talk about the concepts of supply, demand, and price. A comedian in the audience let out a low moan, causing everyone to laugh. Daniel was unperturbed. I know, it's boring. But these abstract concepts have an impact on the real world. Let me give you an example. He reached out and picked up the painting, holding it so that everyone could see. Does anyone recognize this? He asked. Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol. A female voice replied. I'm sorry, miss. I'm afraid you've got the wrong auditorium art classes or held in another building, Daniel grumbled. When the laughter died down, Daniel smiled. Seriously, our art lover is absolutely right. So why am I showing you Andy Warhol in economics class? The answer is that this particular work, or at least one that looks almost exactly like it, was sold in 2022 for just over $195 million. This makes her the record holder for the sale of works by American artists. Several students whistled. I believe, Daniel continued, that none of this audience was the buyer. This caused a few laughs. There are no billionaires here? Well, I was hoping. Anyway, the fact is that at that price, Andy had only one buyer for the Marilyn. But any of us can go to the university bookstore right now and buy a reproduction of Marilyn for $20. Why are there so many buyers in the bookstore and so few at the auction? It's all about the price. At a price of $195 million, there was only one buyer, but at a price of $20, demand increases dramatically. Before you object, I know that there are many factors that affect the market demand for any product or service. We will look at them in the next lessons. But the fact remains that price is one of the, if not the most important, factors determining demand. When the class ended, Daniel was glad that several students came over to ask questions or argue a different point of view. At least I got them thinking about the topic, he thought with satisfaction. Back in his office, he put the printout of Monroe in the file cabinet and then took out his cell phone from his pocket. He felt it vibrate during the lecture, but made it a rule never to interrupt classes to check. Now he saw that Susan would not be home again that evening. It bothered him that it happened so often, but at least it gave him the opportunity to come in and check on his father. When Ezra was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease a few years ago, the elderly man claimed that he was doing a great job in his own home, but Daniel saw that his father's symptoms were getting worse, and anxiety prompted him to visit him more often. When he got through to his father, he launched into a rambling discussion about symptoms, real and imaginary, about doctors who don't know what they're doing, and about the problems of the world in general. When Daniel finally managed to ask if it would be convenient for him if he stopped by, his father insisted that he come and stay for dinner. Daniel tried to protest, but his father interrupted him. "Here," he said, "talk to Paloma," and held out the phone. Paloma was Ezra Morgan's nurse. When his father's condition deteriorated noticeably, Daniel insisted that he be constantly looked after if he wanted to stay at home. The old man sullenly agreed, and immediately began to expel all the nurses sent by the agency with his complaints, insults, and hostile behavior. Just when Daniel decided he would have no choice but to put his father in a nursing home, Paloma arrived. This young woman has two significant advantages over her predecessors. First of all, she was unexpectedly beautiful, which Ezra definitely appreciated. Secondly, Paloma was not at all embarrassed by Ezra's rudeness. When he snarled at her, she retaliated in kind. When he refused to follow the doctor's orders, she pestered him until he gave up and followed them. And when he was grumpy and rude, she ignored him until he stopped trying to piss her off. One day when Daniel came to check on the new nurse, his father surprised him by saying that he approved of Paloma. "She doesn't hold a grudge against me," he declared, and Daniel dared to hope that they had finally found a solution. About 10 months later, these hopes received a serious blow when Paloma called Daniel and told him that she wanted to quit. "It's because of my son Marco," she told him. "My mother took care of him, but now my grandmother is ill, and my mother will have to live with her. Besides, Marco has to go to school, and there's no way I can take care of him and Senor Morgan at the same time." If Daniel was upset by this news, then Ezra simply refused to accept it. To Daniel's surprise, the old man found a solution. "Come live in my house," he told her. "It's quite spacious here. In addition, you will save on rent and travel. I'll even pay for the groceries. But what about Marco? You don't want a 6-year-old running around your house. You know, I already had a 6-year-old boy. Besides, with Marco, I'll have someone to talk to when I get tired of your nagging." She went to Daniel's office to talk to him about the offer. Barely able to cope with his surprise, he immediately saw all the advantages. In addition to constant care from someone his father liked, Daniel believed that living surrounded by family could be beneficial for his father. "It's up to you, Paloma," Daniel said. "Personally, I think this could be a good decision for Dad, and I know that it will be easier for me if he is looked after by someone he likes. But you have to decide for yourself if it's going to be good for you and Marco. I think it might work, Senor Daniel, but it would be better if you tried to come more often, for your father's sake. And Marco will be happy too." And then, to his surprise, she blushed, and then turned and ran out the door. Her reaction confused him, but he was very glad to learn that she had accepted her father's offer. Now, after 18 months of a new arrangement, Daniel was not at all surprised to hear that his father had given in to Paloma's wishes, and was not upset when she also asked him to stay for dinner. Considering that the alternative to this was a solitary takeaway on his university campus, Daniel didn't really resist. In addition to her nursing skills, Paloma turned out to be an excellent cook. It would be great to eat homemade food for a change, he thought, and his mood improved. Susan hated the long drive through the countryside, but she knew it was necessary. Neither she nor Grant could afford to be recognized when they were developing perspectives together. She was worried not only about the length of the trip, but also that there were small, dilapidated houses along the way. "I used to live in exactly the same hole," she thought, and the memories came flooding back to her. Her father abandoned the family when she and her sister were in high school. Her mother and her 2 daughters were forced to move into a rented shack, which she could barely afford on a maid's salary. The girls' classmates at school fared little better, but that didn't stop them from mercilessly bullying their sisters. But Susan was smart. She did well throughout high school, well enough to receive a full scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. Education, she was taught, was a way out of poverty, a way to achieve the same lifestyle as other female students at the university. And although these girls were not unfriendly, the socioeconomic differences could not be ignored. While her classmates danced at fraternity and sisterhood parties on weekends, Susan sat in the dorm and prepared for the tests that were supposed to take place on Monday. While they were spending the summer in Europe, she worked part-time on campus. However, in her freshman year, Susan succeeded when she attracted the attention of a handsome graduate student, an economics teacher. Daniel Morgan was already on his way to a doctorate, but he wasn't a nerd. He has a good sense of humor and likes to chat. When he met her, he found Susan's combination of intelligence and beauty irresistible. There were rules prohibiting relations between teachers and students, but since he studied at the Faculty of Economics and she studied at the Faculty of Fine Arts, these rules were easily ignored. Susan has already dated several students and had several sexual encounters, but she was determined to improve and knew that a reputation as a girl of easy virtue on campus was not the way to success. Now, faced with the prospect of a relationship with a man who had a future, she did her best to take advantage of it. He didn't stand a chance. A man with a future? Ha, she thought angrily. She expected Daniel to become an employee of one of the large investment banks or consulting firms that regularly recruited staff on campus. When he said that his dreams lay in the academic field, she was slightly disappointed. But perhaps he will head a large educational institution, she consoled herself. A quick search on the internet convinced her that several university presidents have economics degrees. But now, 7 years after their wedding, she has discovered that she lives on a university campus in a remote place with her husband, who is satisfied with teaching at a university in a remote place. This is not the future I dreamed of, she swore. In this dysfunctional environment, she got a job raising funds for a local museum in a converted mansion formerly owned by one of Pennsylvania's oil barons. And once again, I found myself dependent on a bunch of rich matrons and their smug offspring, listening to their gossip and obeying their imperious demands. But it won't be for long, she vowed to herself, as she steered the car toward the small rural motel where she and Grant had met. I found myself a new path that I can climb. No sooner had Daniel got out of the car at his father's house than the front door flew open, and a small ball of boyish energy ran up to him. Senor Daniel, will you play football with me?" Marco shouted. "Marco!" Paloma shouted, stepping out onto the porch. "Leave Senor Daniel alone!" "He's been studying all day and he's tired." Before the boy's face could stretch, Daniel waved his mother away. "It's all right, Paloma. Come on, Marco, show me your skills." And the two of them began to play, leading, passing, and hitting a grass-stained soccer ball. As they raced around the yard, Daniel noticed that Paloma had gone into the house and took her father out to look at them. The old man was delighted with what was happening and was happy to cheer them on, although he had never been to a football match in his life. Finally, they stopped when Paloma called them to dinner. Marco protested, but Daniel was just as happy to agree. "I'm not in the right shape to keep up with this kid, especially in football." Expecting a traditional Latin American meal, Daniel was pleasantly surprised when Paloma served a Mediterranean-style dish: chicken kebab with basmati rice, Greek salad, and pita bread on the side. Ezra grumbled that he wanted a hamburger, but Daniel noticed that he had completely eaten his plate. They ate like a family, talking about the day, the plans for the week, and other small things, which further lifted Daniel's spirits. He realized that he hadn't thought about Susan since he arrived. As they were clearing away the plates, Paloma leaned over to him and whispered, "If you're interested, I try to stick to the Mediterranean diet with Senor Morgan whenever he lets me. I want to save his heart as much as possible." "Thank you, Paloma. Whatever you're doing, it seems to be working. I haven't seen Dad so energetic in a long time." After the dishes were in the dishwasher, everyone moved into the living room. After talking a little more, Daniel noticed that Marco was getting quieter. Probably even 7-year-old children can get tired after such an intense game, he thought with amusement. Paloma noticed it too and took Marco to his room. By the time she watched her son get ready for bed, he was already half asleep. But as soon as he lay down, his eyes flashed again. "Mom, can Senor Daniel come and say goodnight to me? We don't want to impose on him," she said sternly, but then resigned herself. "But I'll ask." Daniel was pleased with the boy's request, and he readily followed Paloma to Marco's bed. To his surprise, the boy reached out and hugged him, then lay down, turned away, and closed his eyes. "Good night, Marco," Daniel said gently, tucking the blanket under the boy's shoulder. "Buenas noches." When they returned to the living room, Daniel saw that his father had also dozed off. He helped Paloma carry him to the bedroom and put him to bed, realizing with horror how little his father weighed. When the two of them returned to the living room, Daniel thanked Paloma for the meal and said he was going home. "Why don't you stay a little longer?" "What is it?" she asked, reaching for his hand, but stopped. Could you tell me a little bit about the painting in the living room?" "Of course," he said, and followed her into another room. Andy Warhol's painting, Marilyn Monroe in Blue, hung on the wall in a special frame. Shatterproof glass protected the frame, which was firmly bolted to the wall. There were special pads at the four corners of the frame, sensitive to any pressure changes between the wall and the work of art. On the opposite wall, two small devices were emitting infrared rays, guarding everything that approaches the work. "I'm sure my dad warned you about all the security measures," Daniel said, and Paloma nodded. "That's why I'm not letting Marco in here," she explained. "One day he hit a soccer ball against the wall, and at the same moment a squad of the security company arrived here to sort it out." She shook her head. "We will not make such a mistake again. But I don't know how your father got such a special picture. It's a good story. My grandfather was a printer in Germany before the Second World War. He ran away just before things got bad and came to America with only his last name. In fact, he'd lost part of it too. Some immigration clerk on Ellis Island had changed Morgenstern to Morgan. Anyway, my grandfather found a job as a printer in New York and brought his son, my father, into the business so that he could learn this craft. My father became interested in silkscreen printing, which just became popular in the early 1960s. In short, he began working as an apprentice at a company that printed many of the silkscreens created by Andy Warhol. Apparently one day Warhol noticed my father working late, and he liked him. On impulse, he gave him this test copy that hung on the wall, and even signed a dedication on the back. Not a bad gift for someone whom Warhol hardly knew. I agree, but we must remember that at that time Warhol was selling his silkscreens for only a few $100s. He probably thought that the test print from the artist's engraving was not so valuable. Be that as it may, Warhol's works began to skyrocket in price only later. But isn't it dangerous to keep them here? Not many people know that my father has a Warhol, and it has never been evaluated. But when this auction got such wide publicity, we couldn't ignore the risk. That's when my father took all the security measures. I won't say that they are reliable, but as you and Marco have learned, even touching the wall causes a quick reaction from the security company. She looked at the painting again. "I understand why your father wants to leave her here. He must be very proud of her." "She is," Daniel nodded, "and I'm very proud of her." Paloma smiled and nodded. A little later, Daniel got into his car to return to the old Victorian-style house that the university had provided for him on campus. As he drove away, he looked back at the light coming through the windows of his father's house. "I wish it was as bright at home," he sighed. Susan was often away these days, and even when she was at home, the atmosphere remained cool. He shook his head and drove away. As she left the motel, Susan still felt the delicious post-coital bliss between her thighs. Nothing helps a girl relax like a good lovemaking, she thought contentedly. And Grant Nicholson is a good partner in this regard, in no small part because he is truly in love with her. His ardor practically oozes out of his pores, and when they find themselves in bed, he desperately impatiently brings her to one satisfaction after another. But when she left their dilapidated love nest, her thoughts turned to her husband. It's not that Daniel is a bad husband, and he's certainly not a bad lover, but he just doesn't have the drive and ambition that I need. Grant likes talking to all these millionaires on the board of directors, and he's good at it. Daniel, on the other hand, is content to go to university parties and socialize with other teachers. Every time I have to attend such events, I want to scream. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. But as soon as his old man leaves and Daniel gets his inheritance, I'll divorce him right away. And after receiving my half of the income from Warhol and the house, I will have as much money as these rich bitches, not to mention a high-ranking husband. When she pulled into their driveway, her face twisted into a grin. University housing. Well, I'll put up with this hole a little longer, and my husband too. The next time Daniel saw Paloma, she wasn't smiling anymore. He had just finished grading the exam papers when he heard a knock on his office door. Looking up, he was surprised to see a girl standing there, and her expression filled him with alarm. "What's wrong, Paloma? Is something wrong with my dad? Is Marco all right?" She hurriedly entered, closing the door behind her, and sat down in one of the armchairs. "Your dad's fine, Daniel. While I'm here, my mom will stay with him and Marco, but—" He shook his head impatiently. "So what happened? What's happening? You know that I have a big family in this area, right? I didn't know, but go on. One of my sisters, Christina, works at the Birch Grove. She is the secretary of Mr. Nicholson, the executive director. Okay. Anyway, Christina meets with Mrs. Morgan at the mansion every day. Yes, but... Daniel, I'm sorry, but your wife and Mr. Nicholson are having an affair. Her words hit him hard. His first impulse was to deny the possibility because he didn't want to believe it. But given the current state of their relationship with his wife, he immediately realized that an affair could explain what was happening. Pulling himself together, he leaned forward in his chair. How does your sister know about this? What is it? He asked tensely. Paloma looked unhappy. We have a cousin who works as a maid at the Pocono View Motel. It's north of here, about 20 miles down the highway. He waved his hand impatiently and she hurried on. Your wife and Mr. Nicholson meet there almost every week. The last time was 2 days ago when you had dinner with Signor Morgan, Marco, and me. He gritted his teeth, remembering that evening and how late Susan had gone to bed, but he spoke quietly and with restraint. Paloma, this is very serious. I can't just take the word of someone I've never met, even if she's your cousin. I know, but you don't have to take her word for it. Maybe you can go there with me now? Half an hour later at the motel, Paloma introduced Daniel to her cousin Lourdes, whose knowledge of English was very modest. But while Paloma was helping with the translation, the maid led them to the staff storage room located in the main corridor of the motel. She opened the door to the ventilation system and took out a voice recorder hidden there. Daniel looked at Lourdes, then at Paloma. How did it get here? He growled. Our family gathered and Christina told us about her suspicions about Senor Nicholson and his frequent meetings with Senora Morgan. When she showed us the photo, Lourdes recognized them as a couple who regularly visit the motel. She looked at Daniel pleadingly. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I realized I had to find out the truth. I gave Lourdes the recorder. I hope you don't hate me for this. Daniel ignored her question. Instead, he pointed at the device. Did you listen to the recording? He demanded. She hung her head. Yes, partially. Lourdes played it to me by calling. That's when I realized I had to tell you everything. All right, Daniel said grimly. Tell her to turn on the playback. When Lourdes pressed the arrow button, the volume of the sound startled the three of them. Oh my God, Grant. Yes, yes, don't stop. It came out of a small speaker. Lourdes quickly stopped the playback and then turned to Paloma. Do you want to go back to the beginning? Paloma asked Daniel. Pale Daniel shook his head. No, I recognized Susan's voice. He rubbed his temples. I don't really want to listen to all this damn stuff. Let's just get on with it from now on. The cousin fiddled with the volume control and then pressed play. At first, all they heard was the rustle of sheets and the groan of bed springs. A minute later, the lovers' conversation resumed. God, Susan, you're amazing. I just can't get enough of you, Grant Nicholson said admiringly. Then his tone became almost urgent. Honestly, baby, I don't want to wait any longer. Just say the word and I'll divorce my wife tomorrow. All I want is to be with you. No. Susan's voice rang out sharply. Don't you see, Grant? There's nothing we can do until old Daniel passes away. As soon as he leaves and Daniel inherits Warhol, I can divorce him. He will have to auction it as part of a settlement agreement, and I will receive my half of the proceeds. After that, you can say goodbye to Greta, and we'll finally be together. Are you sure you can get half of the Warhol? I thought the inheritance was protected. There was a smirk in Susan's voice. Don't worry about that. I have a scammer who knows how to get around this. And since he gets paid depending on the size of the deal, I can guarantee that he is very motivated. Yes, but how much longer do we have to wait? Nicholson whimpered. Be patient, baby, Susan reassured him. The old man is going downhill fast. We'll get what we want soon. Daniel reached out and angrily jabbed his finger at the off button. Insidious fool, she's thought it all out. He slammed his fist on the table, startling the two women. Then he turned and walked out of the motel. Paloma gave Lourdes a quick hug, then grabbed the recorder and hurried to the parking lot. She found Daniel standing by his car, looking off into the distance. He turned to her as she approached, and his eyes reflected the anger and despair of a man who had been betrayed. I tried so hard, Paloma. I knew she wasn't happy in our marriage, but I kept trying to make things better. His expression darkened. Now I know why nothing worked. Now his voice was full of determination. Get in the car. We need to get back to the city. She got into the passenger seat, and when they pulled out onto the road, she said timidly, I hope you're not mad at me, Daniel. I felt that you would want to know what she was doing. He turned his head from side to side. I'm not mad at you, Paloma, but I'm really mad at Susan. What are you going to do? You're not going to hurt her, are you? He looked at her. Yes, I will harm her, as well as Nicholson. Seeing the expression on her face, he added, but not in the way you imagine it. I'm not cruel, but I guarantee they won't like what happens. She reached out to take his hand. I don't want you to get in trouble, Daniel. I just couldn't. He gave her a small smile. Don't worry, Paloma. Everything will be fine. Then his smile disappeared. While you're dealing with your mother and Marco, I need to talk to Dad. He shook his head sadly. He was so excited when I married Susan. I was very impressed with her. I couldn't wait for us to have children. When he finds out what I found out, he'll be as upset as I am. He glanced sideways at Paloma. It's ironic, you know. I was so upset every time Susan said she wasn't ready for children. But now I'm very glad that we didn't have them. They drove the rest of the way in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The conversation with his father was long and painful, but in the end both men worked out a plan of action. Daniel's first step was to file for divorce in order to thwart Susan's plan. The father promised that he would ask his lawyer to recommend a divorce lawyer to him. He also warned his son not to say or do anything that might suggest to Susan that he had learned something. I can do that, Dad, Daniel agreed. I'll just avoid her for as long as possible until I'm ready to be served. Considering how little time we spend with each other, it shouldn't be too difficult. To hide his feelings, Daniel spent most of the weekend on campus, checking jobs, updating lesson plans, and generally trying to keep his academic life from being too disrupted by the impending divorce. When his father called him on Monday with a recommendation, Daniel immediately contacted the lawyer's office to make an appointment. But I was disappointed to learn that I would not be able to meet this woman until Thursday. He thought about looking for another lawyer on the internet, but then decided against it. If Susan tries to pull off some kind of legal fraud, I need someone really good on my side. I can hold out a little longer. When Thursday finally arrived, Daniel was glad he had been patient. His new lawyer looked competent and confident. I suppose I understand what your wife is planning, but I don't think you should worry about your father's painting, the woman reassured him. If we file a lawsuit quickly, then Warhol will in no way become part of the property sharing agreement. She promised that the lawsuit would be ready to be filed next week, and the court order could be served on the same day. Almost done, Daniel thought as he walked back to his office on campus. And if we're lucky, we'll take care of Mr. Grant Nicholson too. For the first time since he found out about Susan's cheating, he felt a little relaxed. His complacency was shattered by a call on Sunday. When he answered, at first he heard nothing but a woman's sobs. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I tried so hard to help him, I really tried. An icy terror gripped his heart. Help who, Paloma? What happened? Senor Morgan, she screamed, then stopped. I have to go. The doctors have arrived. The line broke. Jumping to his feet, Daniel ran to his car and rushed to his father's house. The street was blocked by a fire truck, an ambulance, and another car from the fire department. Parking on the street, he ran to the house and managed just in time to see the paramedics roll out a gurney on the porch. Is he all right? What is it? He asked frantically. The technician looked at him. Are you a son? Yes, is he alive? The man slowly shook his head. I'm sorry, but we couldn't do anything. When we arrived, he was gone. His heart stopped beating. It looks like he had a massive stroke or an aneurysm. But what about defibrillation? It could help, right? The man looked at him sympathetically. I'm sorry, sir, but even if we could get his heart started, nothing else would be able to work, you know? You wouldn't want that, and neither would he. As the gurney was loaded into the ambulance and slowly taken away, Daniel could only stand in shock. Finally, he forced himself to enter the house. When Paloma saw him, she rushed to him and sobbed in his arms. I'm sorry, Daniel. I tried so hard to get him back. I did chest compressions until the medics arrived, but it wasn't enough. I'm so sorry. Through his tears, he held her close to look into her face. It's not your fault, Paloma. You did everything you could. I talked to the medic outside. He said that his father probably had a stroke or an aortic aneurysm. He probably died before you even got to him. She dropped her head on Daniel's chest and continued to sob. He was sitting at the table and chatting with me. Suddenly he grabbed his head and said it hurt. Then he just tipped over and fell to the floor. Oh, Daniel, it was terrible. He carefully led the upset woman to a chair so that she sat down and then went to get water for both of them. When he returned, he asked, Where's Marco? Marco? Madre de Dios, I almost forgot. He's at school. I have to pick him up. She started crying again. Marco will be so upset. He loved your father very much. She hurried away, leaving Daniel alone in the suddenly empty house. He sat there for a long time, and grief clouded his attempts to realize how suddenly his life had changed. He knew his father was dying, but he wasn't ready to lose him so soon. He started crying again, and there was no one to comfort him. Finally, he pulled himself together and began making a list of those who needed to be notified and the tasks that needed to be completed. After writing down everything he could think of, he began the painful task of making phone calls. After phoning or leaving messages for the most urgent group, Daniel locked his father's house and drove to the birch grove to complete the task he had left for himself. As much as he hated the idea, he decided to break the news to Susan personally. I want to see how she reacts, he thought bitterly. She was amazed when he entered her small office, and when she heard the news, she said everything she needed to and showed appropriate grief. But watching her, he had to bite his tongue to keep from getting angry. These are crocodile tears, he grumbled to himself. She must be absolutely delighted, because now she will be able to continue the implementation of her plan. But he managed to restrain himself until he left. As soon as he left, Susan rushed out of her office and, almost jumping up, ran down the corridor to tell Grant Nicholson the news. Grant was startled by Susan's sudden appearance and taken aback by the news she had delivered. He immediately began to express his condolences, but she interrupted him. Can't you see that the news is good? This is what we've been waiting for. The old man is no more. His property goes to Daniel. I can file for divorce, settle the property issue, and when everything is finally settled, you and I can be together. Grant felt his excitement match hers. I can't believe the wait is over. So when are you planning to file for divorce? She thought for a moment. I don't want to sound heartless. I'll wait until his father is buried and a memorial service is served before submitting the documents. It makes sense, Grant admitted, but don't wait too long. Remember, I need time to sort things out with Greta. The next few days were filled with all the sorrowful responsibilities that death entails for Daniel. The first and most urgent was his father's funeral. Despite the fact that his father was not a devout man, he left an order that he wanted to be buried according to Jewish traditions. This meant arranging the burial the next day. When all the arrangements for his father's burial were made, Daniel began organizing a memorial service for friends and neighbors who were unable to attend the funeral. He has no other living relatives, but Ezra has made many friends during his career, and now they have come to pay their last respects. Daniel's friends and colleagues also came to express their condolences and support. Seeing so many people, he was comforted. Both the funeral and the memorial service were difficult for Daniel, not only because of the grief he was experiencing, but also because he was forced to attend them with Susan. As before, she played the role of a grief-stricken wife perfectly. But Daniel knew what she was really thinking, and his anger turned into a burning hatred. At that time, Daniel's new lawyer called and asked for instructions on how to file for divorce. Given the many responsibilities he faced, Daniel asked her to postpone the divorce. I'll need to contact you later, he told her. My life is pretty crazy right now. After the memorial service was over, a new, unexpected complication arose. Back at her father's house, Paloma asked him when he wanted her and Marco to move out. Daniel was indignant. You can't leave, Paloma. First of all, you have nowhere to go, and I have no intention of kicking you out on the street. In addition, if the house is empty, it will become a target for thieves or vandals. Besides, if you go somewhere else, it will most likely mean transferring Marco to a new school, and he's doing well at the old one. I don't want to take any chances. You should stay, at least for a while. She gratefully agreed, knowing full well that Daniel's kindness and care were a more significant factor than the reasons he had voiced. After his father was buried and the funeral service was completed, Daniel contacted his father's lawyer to find out what needed to be done in connection with the registration of his father's inheritance. The list of steps he would have to take in connection with the probate process was very long. When he finished getting to know them with Daniel, the lawyer added an unexpected duty. Ezra, the lawyer told Daniel, asked that the reading of the will take place as soon as possible, even before it is submitted to the court. Moreover, his father had left a list of people who needed to be invited. After hearing the list, Daniel understood everything. I have one request, he told the family lawyer, to make the reading of the will as official as possible. Could we hold it at your law office? If it takes place there, and your office sends out invitations, I think there will be a better chance that everyone who should be there will come." The old man readily agreed. On the appointed day, Daniel and Susan came to the lawyer's office separately. They took their places at the small conference table in the law library and greeted each other with forced cordiality. With the exception of services for his father, they hardly spent time together. Now Daniel could see that, despite the outward calm, his wife was practically seething with excitement. On the contrary, he was calm and collected. A few minutes later, Paloma came in and introduced herself to the lawyer. Susan stared at her, then leaned over to Daniel and asked angrily, "What is she doing here?" He stared at her without emotion. "She's invited." Before Susan could answer, Grant Nicholson entered the room. "Were you invited too?" "What is it?" she asked. He nodded. I don't know why, but the invitation was quite unambiguous. Just at that moment, the lawyer stood up and defiantly cleared his throat. "Please have your attention. It seems that everyone who was invited is present. The late Mr. Morgan strongly wished that each of you be present at the announcement of his last will and testament," he said in a resonant voice. "I'm not going to try your patience by reading out all the legal details of his will, but instead Mr. Morgan wanted me to, as he put it, get down to business." He cleared his throat. Firstly, the late Mr. Morgan appointed Daniel Morgan, his only child, as executor of the will. Daniel's responsibilities will include ensuring payment of all taxes due, and repayment of all remaining debts and other obligations. After these issues are properly settled, he will see to the disposal of the property in accordance with the conditions and wishes of the father. Daniel has agreed to perform these duties and, as I was informed, has already begun the process of settling debts, taxes, and other obligations. Susan shot a quick glance at Grant, giving him a brief smile of anticipation. "This brings us to the issue of the distribution of property," the lawyer continued. "The first will concerns Mr. Morgan's house, where he lived for the last 27 years of his life, as well as the land on which it is located. His will reads, 'I hereby leave my house and land to Paloma Contreras in gratitude for the long service she rendered me during my illness and need. I also leave her the balance of all funds in my checking account to help pay the bills.'" Susan exclaimed in surprise. How could he give his house to this maid? He should go to Daniel. "Yes, you're right," Paloma interjected, recovering from her surprise. "Daniel should get it, not me." She looked at Daniel for support, but he didn't return her gaze. "Anyway," the lawyer continued, "the late Mr. Morgan made his wishes clear. Now, if I may I move on to the second will?" When everyone was quiet, the lawyer continued. "The second will concerns an Andy Warhol painting hanging in my living room. I hereby bequeath the Warhol to the Birch Grove Mansion and Museum to become part of its permanent collection." "Oh my God," Nicholson gasped. "No, it's not true," Susan screamed. "He couldn't do that. He had to leave the Warhol to Daniel." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan, but Mr. Morgan bequeathed the Warhol to the Birch Grove," the lawyer said. "He would like the painting to hang in a prominent place in the museum." "But that means Daniel won't get anything," Susan cried. "Did his father cut him out of his will? How could he do that? This is wrong." "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer said loudly, "I beg your attention. I haven't finished reading the terms of the will yet. Please keep in mind that the second will that Mr. Morgan made is conditional. The will goes on to say, 'My gift to the Birch Grove depends on the fulfillment of two requirements. First, Birch Grove must immediately and permanently sever all professional relations with Mrs. Susan Morgan. Secondly, Mr. Grant Nicholson, the executive director of Birch Grove, must immediately and permanently end the relationship he maintained with Mrs. Susan Morgan. If at least one of these two requirements is not fully fulfilled, the ownership of the Warhol passes to the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh." He turned to Grant Nicholson. "If you're interested, sir, I sent the notice of this conditional will to Pittsburgh just before this meeting. As far as I understand, the Warhol Museum will closely monitor your compliance with these requirements." "It's just incredible," Susan cried. "This harmful old man has no right to interfere in our personal lives." She turned to Daniel. "This is all your machinations, isn't it? You're trying to cheat me out of what's legally mine." "I would never do that, Susan. In fact, what belongs to you by law is in my possession." With that, he handed her the envelope he had brought with him to the meeting. She tore it open and stared at the contents as if they were in Greek. "What is it?" "This is a legal notice that I have filed for divorce," he said. Then, taking out his iPhone and taking a picture to document his actions, he added gloomily, Susan Morgan, you've been served. You bastard, you can't divorce me. I'm divorcing you. Stop it, she screamed. Daniel just grinned. Screaming, Susan did not notice that Grant had quietly slipped out of the room. When she finally realized he wasn't there, she hurried after him. Meanwhile, Paloma was trying to argue with Daniel. This is wrong, Daniel. Senor Morgan should have left his house to you, not me. You're his son, and it's wrong that you don't have anything. Daniel smiled now. Paloma, it's okay. My father and I have discussed everything. He loved you and Marco and wanted you to be taken care of when he was gone. He knew that I understood everything and that I wanted it too. He took her by the shoulders and looked intently into her eyes. Don't you see? He was a gruff, old-fashioned man who found it difficult to express his feelings. He didn't know how to express how much he appreciates your care, your communication, and the fact that you don't dump all the shit on him. This is his way of expressing his love. She wiped away her tears. Marco and I, we loved him too, Daniel. Susan literally ran down the corridor of the Birch Grove to Grant's office. Ignoring his secretary, she stormed into her boss's office. Grant, she panted. This is wonderful news. With the replenishment of the Warhol collection, many new visitors will be attracted to the Birch Grove. You will become the head of the most prestigious art museum in the area. Thank you, Susan, he replied carefully. I think you're right. And when everything settles down, she continued, our relationship will no longer have to be hidden, as you always wanted. His face sharpened. Didn't you hear that the old man's will added a clarification to the bequeathed property? What is it? He asked sharply. It cannot be legally binding, she replied. Yes, it will become a cause for gossip among the members of the country club, but it will quickly fade away. With the exception of the Warhol Museum, he objected. They will be happy to add such an important exhibit to their collection, so they will be watching us very closely. There was fear in her voice. But as I said, it can't be legal. No court will comply with such a requirement. Now Grant was angry. Do you really expect the Birch Grove to sue the Warhol Museum? Do you know what resources they have? They have money from the Carnegie Endowment behind them. If we go to court with them, the legal costs can ruin us. He stood up and handed his ex-lover a package of documents. I'm sorry, Susan, but I've already talked to Mr. Worthington about this. As of today, you are no longer an employee of the Birch Grove. Grant, you can't do that. Not after all we've meant to each other. Then her tone became sharper. Besides, you don't want me to tell your wife about us, do you? I've already confessed to her, he replied coldly to Susan. And as soon as I'm done here, I'm going home to continue humiliating myself. I hope that getting the prestige of the wife of the executive director of the Birch Grove will calm her offended feelings. And now it's time for you to leave the mansion. I'll arrange for the severance package to be mailed to you. She stood and glared at him, clenching her fists. Instinctively, he took half a step back, fearing that she might rush at him. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, heading down the hallway to her former office. There, I quickly gathered up a few personal items and left. As she passed her secretary's desk, Evita asked, Are you leaving already, Mrs. Morgan? Yes, Susan replied without even looking at her. As her heels clicked on the marble, Evita said after her, Adios, then hurried to Christina's desk to tell her about what had just happened. Daniel was rummaging through the refrigerator in search of dinner when he heard the sound of keys in the front door. When he went out into the living room, he saw Susan enter the room with a sullen expression on her face. When she saw her future ex-husband, her expression turned angry. It's all you're doing, isn't it? How long have you known about Grant and me? Long enough to blow up your little scheme, he replied. So you made Ezra change his will, she said bitterly. He planned to leave everything to you, and you persuaded him to change his will. Why did you do that? Because I wanted to be absolutely sure that you would never get your hands on everything, no matter what happened. When I heard that you and your lawyer were planning to declare Warhol common property, I became sure that this would not happen by giving it to the Birch Grove. Besides, it gave me the opportunity to ruin your little romance with Grant. I thought his love would evaporate very quickly if the choice was between you and Warhol. So you really hate me that much? He looked at her incredulously. After what you tried to do? You're damn right, he shouted. She stared at him, shocked that he was so angry. After a moment, he pulled himself together again. All I want to know is, have you ever loved me? She sighed and flopped into a chair. I think she used to love me when we first got married. You were so energetic, full of potential. I thought that you would rise up the career ladder by taking me with you." She shook her head, a bitter expression curling her lips. "Imagine my disappointment when I saw which path you chose instead. Soon after that, I started looking for more suitable opportunities. So it's always been about money and prestige for you? Was love and a good life not enough? How like Norman Rockwell?" She grinned. "Don't you know that's what losers choose when they don't have what it takes to win? Family, friends, society, that's how you imagine losing? What I want is respect, the kind that money and position in society give. This is the most important thing, the rest is just for show." He started to argue, but then decided that it wasn't worth it. "So, what's going to happen next?" Her bravado evaporated. "I'm leaving. Thanks to you, my reputation in this city has turned into trash. As soon as I get everything I need, I'll leave. And don't worry, if we divide the property fairly, I won't fight the divorce. All I need is half of our savings and half of the proceeds from the house." "I'm sorry, Susan. You forget that the house is not ours. It belongs to the university." She ground her teeth. "You've always been so smart. Why couldn't I be more ambitious?" Without waiting for an answer, she went into the bedroom. After a while, she came out with a suitcase, a bag for clothes, and a makeup bag. "I'm leaving," she said. "I'll ask my lawyer to contact yours, and we'll arrange a divorce as soon as possible." She glared at him. "At least we agree on one thing. We both want to end this marriage." He looked at her curiously. "So where are you going?" "As far away from here as possible, to where I can start all over again, hopefully with someone more ambitious." Daniel watched her leave. Good riddance, he thought with satisfaction. This time Susan was true to her word, and their divorce went smoothly. Daniel was tormented by the need to pay alimony, but given that his future ex-wife is now unemployed, he could hardly challenge them. "It's not a big price to pay to get rid of her, and it's even less if you consider what she tried to do to you," the lawyer advised him. At the same time, Daniel was busy acting as the executor of his father's estate. New demands seemed to appear every day. The distribution of copies of the death certificate, the termination of Social Security payments by his father, the notification of the tax service and the filing of the final application 1040, the mailing of legal notices to creditors, and much more. After classes, Daniel regularly found himself at his father's house, sorting through things he had accumulated over the years, paying bills and dealing with his father's financial affairs. To his horror, he discovered that his father paid for everything with paper checks. While it was not possible to transfer accounts to electronic payments, Daniel found that he wrote more checks in a few weeks than in several years. Although this job took a lot of time, it gave Daniel the opportunity to work in the company of Paloma and Marco. His house on campus seemed dark and gloomy, and his father's house was full of light and life. He often worked into the evening and had dinner with both of them. He felt guilty for imposing, but Paloma begged him to stay. Even when he was almost done settling his father's affairs, she begged him to continue having dinner with them. "It's hard to cook just for the two of us," she insisted, and he gladly gave in to her request. Belonging to a family, in his opinion, is a good medicine that heals the grief of losing a father and the bitterness of breaking up a marriage. A few weeks later, Daniel got a call from his father's lawyer. "The probate court has signed the final report on the condition of your father's estate. Now you can dispose of his property at your discretion." "Really? I thought it usually took months to make a will." The old man chuckled. "Normally you'd be right, but your father's will seems to be at the top of the list. Of course, this may be due to the fact that the board of directors of Birch Grove employs people with a capital letter. It looks like they can't wait to get their new prize. Anyway, you can move forward now." An hour after the conversation with the lawyer, Daniel received a call from Grant Nicholson and asked when Birch Grove would be able to receive Warhol into its ownership. "As I think you know, the museum and I have fully fulfilled the terms of your father's will, and now that it has passed the registration procedure, we are looking forward to the opportunity to proceed with the transfer." Although the legal hurdles were over, a new complication arose. The curator of the museum insisted that her people pack and transport the silkscreen themselves to the Birch Grove, but the transfer had to be coordinated with the security company, which had to carefully disable all protective devices and systems. The safe dismantling and decommissioning of various systems is a difficult task. It would take almost a whole day for the two groups to make the transfer. Waiting for the progress reports in his office, Nicholson felt like a child on Christmas Eve. By tomorrow morning, The most valuable piece of art that the Birch Grove has ever owned will be at their disposal. In honor of this event, the museum was going to hold a private screening for the board of directors and special guests the following evening. The awkwardness of his affair with Susan was behind him, and the future of the museum and its executive director loomed ahead. After agreeing with a security company to protect his father's house during the Warhol broadcast, Daniel took Paloma and Marco on a day trip to Pocono. The three of them went hiking along a scenic trail, had lunch at the Flagstaff Lodge Hotel, and took a ride along the Lehigh Gorge Park Landscape Railway. By the time they got home, everyone except the security guard from the security company had already left. The living room was cleaned and the furniture was put in its place. However, the smiling face of Marilyn Monroe depicted on the silkscreen was missing, and all three felt his absence. Trying to dispel the gloomy mood, Daniel brainstormed. "It's too late to cook dinner. Shall we order a pizza?" The offer was gladly accepted, and soon the three of them were already eating several large pizzas. By the time they were done, the heavy meal and the day's chores had exhausted them all. Marco was already asleep, and Daniel carried him to bed. As he headed for the front door, Paloma stopped him. "Please, Daniel, stay the night. With all these security systems gone, I'll feel safer. You can sleep in your father's room." He tried to object, but she insisted, and after a long day, he didn't want to argue. Therefore, when Paloma went to sleep in her room, after the death of Senor Morgan, she never changed her place. Daniel stripped down to a t-shirt and boxer shorts and lay down in his father's bed. At first, the memories and the strangeness of the bed kept him awake, but he must have been more comfortable than he thought, because he fell asleep quickly. However, after a while, he was woken up by a sound from the hallway. As he sat up in bed, wondering if he had imagined it, the sound was repeated. Suddenly, he saw Paloma's dark figure open the door, tiptoe over to his bed, and slide under the covers. He started to say something, but she put a soft hand over his mouth. "Please, Daniel, it's been so long since I've seen you, and I've been so lonely." Then she took her hand away and pressed it to his lips. In an instant, all his objections were forgotten, and he returned her kiss with a passion that overwhelmed them both. He paused for a moment, looking with satisfaction at the slender athletic figure revealed in the moonlight. But when he started caressing her, she stopped him. "No, I need you now, Daniel. Please don't keep me waiting any longer." The next evening, the opening of the Warhol installation was celebrated in the Birch Grove. Grant Nicholson arrived early, leaving his wife to drive separately, "so that you could appear in all your glory," he told her. As he was looking through the list of necessary activities, there was a knock on his office door. Looking up, he saw the worried face of the curator of the museum. "What's the matter?" "What is it?" he asked impatiently. "Sir, there's something wrong with Warhol," the woman said worriedly. "What? The painting is not damaged, is it?" "No, sir, nothing like that. It just doesn't look quite right." "It doesn't look quite right. What are you talking about?" "It's just that some colors don't look the way they should." "This is an artist's test print," Nicholson exploded, "and it doesn't have to look perfect." The keeper grimaced, but remained of her opinion. "And Warhol's signature, sir, it's not faded as it should be. After all, he signed it in the 60s, the ink should have faded." "And that bothers you?" "How do you know what ink Warhol used? Come back and make sure everything is ready. The guests will arrive any minute." The little woman didn't budge. "But that's not the main thing, sir. The problem is that it's the wrong size." "What?" "Yes, sir. Warhol's Marilyn Monroe measures 91.5 centimeters by 91.5. I looked to be sure. The test print must be the same size, but this one is a square with a side of only 89 centimeters. Worthington's mouth opened involuntarily. "So what do you want to say?" The keeper looked like she was about to cry. "Sir, this engraving is a fake. A fake. There is no way it can be authentic." "Oh my God," the museum director exclaimed, leaning back in his chair and trying to comprehend the horror of her revelation. "Are you sure?" "What is it?" he asked desperately. "Yes, sir. I am so sorry." He stared silently into the distance, stunned by what was happening. Sir, the guardian interjected excitedly. "What are we going to do?" "Maybe we should hang her up after all." "Are you crazy?" Nicholson exclaimed, making the woman flinch. "If people find out that we deliberately hung a fake work of art, it will mean the end of the Birch Grove." He flinched and then pointed a finger at the keeper. "Take off the work and hide it. Tell your people to turn off the lights and put up a sign that says, 'The event has been canceled.'" When the woman seemed to hesitate, Nicholson screamed, Do it. Do it now, before it's too late. The keeper ran away, and Nicholson leaned back in his chair, thinking about the misfortune that had befallen him. An idea occurred to him, and he rushed to his secretary's desk. Call the guard at the main entrance and tell him to chain the main gate. Quick, quick. She stopped, startled. What should I tell him to tell the guests? Just tell me that the event has been canceled due to extraordinary circumstances. Nothing more. Now hurry up. And no more phone calls, okay? The frightened girl nodded, but before she could pick up the phone, the bell rang. Sir, she said, it's the keeper again. Do you want to talk to her? What does she need? He asked rhetorically, while the secretary sat in nervous expectation. Okay, I'll see her in my office, and you call on the other line and make sure that no one else comes in, he ordered. Returning to his desk, Nicholson picked up the phone and the keeper began to mutter something. The supplier here, sir, wants to know what to do with the food you ordered. Tell him to take it back, Nicholson exploded. We definitely won't need it. I've already tried to do that, sir, but he says he can't. Everything is already laid out on the tables. He says it's illegal, and now he can't take her away. Damn it, then tell him to take it to a homeless shelter. How? Champagne and caviar, sir? Just do it, he barked and hung up. Leaning back in his chair, Nicholson rested his head on his hands, trying to figure out how to get out of the disaster. This can't be happening, he repeated to himself. Could you explain to me what, for God's sake, is going on? A familiar voice rang out. I had to walk all the way from the main gate to get here. The exhausted director looked at the reddened face of the chairman of the board of directors. Adrenaline surged into Grant's bloodstream as he desperately tried to figure out how to calm the angry man. Actually, Mr. Worthington, we managed to avoid a disaster. When we discovered the problems with the Warhol painting, I realized that you would not want the celebration to continue. What do you mean by the problem with the Warhol painting? The executive director demanded, leaning threateningly towards Nicholson. Sir, it looks like the engraving is a fake, a forgery, sir. A fake, Worthington shouted. How the hell could you accept a fake? You must be an expert in the field of art. Didn't it occur to you to inspect it before turning on the PR machine and bragging to the whole world about your success? I know what she looks like, sir, but there was a will issue, and then we had to work with a security company to get her here. Sir, you should have seen the security this old man had. That's enough, Worthington thundered. As things stand now, the Birch Grove will become a laughingstock in the art world for many years to come. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of the board of directors, saying that you are responsible for this failure. Consider yourself fired as of tonight. As soon as you can get through this terrible traffic jam that you have set up there, you need to leave this room and never come back here. Before Nicholson could protest, Van Worthington turned and strode away, not even glancing at the cowering girl at the table. Oh my God, I'm finished, the former CEO moaned. When this becomes known, no museum in the country will hire me. While he was sitting indulging in self-pity, his secretary suddenly appeared. Sir, there's a call for you, she said shakily. I told you, Nicholson growled. No more calls. I'm sorry, Mr. Nicholson, but this is your wife, and she asks me to tell you that if you don't talk to her, then you shouldn't come home tonight. Nicholson broke down. All right, put me through, he agreed. When the connection was established, he had no doubt how angry Greta was. You better have a damn good explanation for this, Grant. I've been stuck here in traffic for God knows how long. People walk back and forth along the rows of cars, and when they see me, they want to know what's going on. And I, the wife of the executive director, am as ignorant as they are. If you wanted to humiliate me, there's no better way to do it. She paused to catch her breath. So, what can you say in your defense? It's very simple, dear, Nicholson said calmly. When we hung the Warhol in the showroom, we discovered that it was, well, that it was a fake. A fake, she exclaimed. Of course, we couldn't exhibit a fake, so we had no choice but to cancel the exhibition. It's a pity that we didn't discover this problem until the last minute. He paused, swallowed, and then decided to accept his fate. Unfortunately, in such situations, someone has to become a scapegoat, regardless of whether he is guilty or not. Despite everything I've done for Birch Grove, Van Worthington has just relieved me of my duties, and from now on, she gasped. Did Worthington fire your ass? Oh, Moybog, this really cannot but please. She took a deep breath. Look, Grant, I've suffered a lot from you over the years, and not least of it was your dirty affair with that little slut you hired as director of development. I've overlooked it too many times, but now it's gone too far. Don't come home today or ever again, except to pick up your personal belongings. My lawyer will file for divorce first thing in the morning. Do you understand?" He nodded with a defeated sigh. "Do you understand?" she repeated. "Yes, dear." When he heard that the call had been interrupted, he lowered his head to his desk, completely shattered. Paloma learned about the disastrous opening of the exhibition at the Birch Grove and the dismissal of Grant Nicholson from Christina. When she hurried to tell Daniel about it, he greeted the news with satisfaction, but not with surprise. "I told you I'd get back at him for what he did to my marriage," he said. She looked at him blankly. "But how could you know that this would happen?" "I didn't know. Well, not really. But he set it up so that he would most likely destroy himself." He chuckled. "I could not have known that he would do it so publicly and humiliatingly, but as a result, I was sure, regardless of that. And after what he and Susan tried to do, I think he got what he deserved." Paloma looked at him carefully now. "So what exactly did you do, Senor Daniel? I still don't understand." He smiled. "Come with me to my office at the university. I can show you everything there." When they were in his cluttered office, he pulled out a chair for her and then sat down himself. "Let's talk about Susan first," he said. "As you know, her plan was to keep the affair with Nicholson a secret until Parkinson's disease killed my father. Her father's condition was deteriorating rapidly, so she was sure she wouldn't have to wait too long. Before her father's death, she could not apply for a divorce because she needed me to inherit his property. That way, she would get half of everything. His house was already valuable, but the real prize, of course, was his war hall. I don't know what legal maneuver she was planning to pull off, but her lawyer was confident that he would be able to register war hall as joint property. After settling the dispute, she would have walked away with half the auction value, a lot of money. But you and your cousin found out about her affair, and when I found out what she and Grant were up to, I went to talk to my father. I knew he wanted to leave the war hall to me, but when I found out about Susan's plans, I strongly asked him to leave his job at Birch Grove. Not only will she become inaccessible to her, but we will also be able to use the bequeathed property as a lever of pressure on her." He smiled, and it worked. When Grant found out that the only way to get a war hall for Birch Grove would be to sever all ties with my wife, he dumped Susan like a hot potato. Daniel was lost in thought. I don't know if Grant was really in love with Susan, but I'm sure she was just using him as another rung on the social ladder. Anyway, she quickly realized how deep his affection for her was. When my father's will was read out, she lost her job, her lover, and, of course, her marriage to me. Everything turned out as I had hoped. By the way, a friend told me the other day that Susan had moved to Allentown. He had heard that the only job she could find was a job at a telemarketing center selling insurance. Instead of moving up the career ladder, my ex-wife went down significantly. Perhaps this is the most painful punishment I could wish for her. "I understand how you got back at Susan," Paloma nodded. "And in my opinion, she got exactly what she deserved. Cheating on your husband is bad enough, but plotting to cash in on you and your father is terrible," she said, using the Spanish pronunciation. "But what about Nicholson? What did you do to him?" He chuckled. "You know what happened at the Birch Grove last night, don't you?" "Well, I know something. Mostly I was just shocked to find out that your father's impression is not real." There was a sad look in her eyes. "In a way, I'm glad Senor Morgan didn't have to hear this cruel news." Daniel looked at her appraisingly. "It says a lot that your first reaction is to think about my father." He got up from his seat. "But don't worry too much about him." Reaching for the filing cabinet, he took out the Marilyn Monroe textbook he had used in the introductory course and put it on the table. She looked at him in disbelief. "A great writer once said that the best way to keep something safe is to hide it in plain sight. Let me show you something." He turned the print over so that she could see the back, covered with brown paper. Carefully peeling off the paper, he exposed the inscription, "To Ezra Morgan for all his hard work, Andy Warhol." "Is this a real impression?" Paloma gasped. "But he's the one you use in your classes. You told me that yourself. And he's just in your office?" Daniel smiled and nodded. "But when did you manage to replace him? The other engraving should have been hanging in your father's living room long before Marco and I moved in. If anything, it was long before you found out about Susan's plans. And with all the security that Senor Morgan had, how could you replace him?" Daniel chuckled. At first, Dad did not think that his impression was so expensive. After all, Warhol initially sold his prints for only a few $100s apiece. But as the popularity of his work grew, Dad began to worry that he had an authentic print of the artist hanging in his house. We discussed this issue with him, and I suggested changing the real thing to a cheap impression. I can keep the real Warhol here and use it in my lectures, so that no one suspects that it has any value, and the reproduction will remain hanging on his living room wall. Later, when the cost of the Warhol was growing all the time, my father came up with the idea to put a guard to protect it. I decided that no one would doubt the authenticity of the work protected by all these security measures. It turned into a kind of game for him, constantly looking for new high-tech devices to protect himself. Daniel smiled at Paloma. Fortunately, there were no hacking attempts, but I'm sure that all these security measures helped convince Nicholson that he got the real thing. So you changed the print before I went to work for your father? That's right. I intended to switch them when my father eventually passed away. But after I found out about Grant and Susan, I saw a way to get back at both of them. After I talked to my father that evening, he asked his lawyer to rewrite the will so that Nicholson would definitely leave Susan. Then he allowed Grant to accept the fake Warhol, deciding that he would want to show off his prize as soon as possible and as publicly as possible. Of course, he took the bait. And like Susan, he lost his job, his marriage, and his reputation. And now what? My plan is to let all this commotion at the Birch Grove die down. As soon as this happens, I will quietly inform the board of directors that I found the real Warhol in my father's storage container, which I did not know he had. After they can verify its authenticity, I will ask them to hang a plaque on it in memory of my father's connection with Warhol. Didn't you want to get the Warhol for yourself? After all, he is very valuable. He smiled. To be honest, I didn't want to at all. I never wanted to take responsibility for owning an important piece of art. And as for money, it's Susan who craves wealth and status, not me. After I saw what that thirst did to her, I'm just as happy that he's gone out of my hands. Then his smile grew even wider. Besides, I hope that all this will help me achieve a more important goal. She looked at him uncertainly. Which one? To become part of a new family. What did you just say? What new family? Daniel walked around the table and took her hands in his. A new family, which includes you, Marco, and me. When the graduate student who came to Professor Morgan saw the couple in each other's arms, she smiled and tiptoed out. Once she was far away in the hallway, she called out to a fellow student. Do you remember how worried we were about Professor Morgan when he lost both his father and his wife? I think our beloved professor will be fine.